I have a kind of, let's say, special mission to introduce our keynote speaker, who is a world acclaimed political scientist and historian, I would say, from Great Britain, Andrew Wilson. So Andrew Wilson is a senior policy fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Yes. And also he teaches about Ukraine and Eastern Europe at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University College London. I would also like to mention that Andrew has published a number of very important books, actually the last one I see here on the table, but also I would like to mention his previous books. So probably one of the most famous of them is The Ukrainians' Unexpected Nations, published at least 3 times, maybe more. And Andrew also published a book on Belarus, which is called Belarus, the Last Dictatorship, the Last European Dictatorship in 2012. And he also published a book about Ukraine's Orange Revolution, 2006. And last but not least, we have this very new publication from the Yale University Press, which is called Ukraine Crisis, What It Means for the West. And today, Andrew Wilson will give a talk, which is called Ukraine from Revolution to War. We are very much looking forward to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. The title isn't mine, it was the title I was given, but it's a very good title. It's my job to explain why. I should warn the translators that I won't read the text word for word, and I will leave some time for questions at the end. But, Mr. President, Mr. Absent President, MEPs, colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be speaking here today. I'd like to begin with a reminder of what all this was originally supposed to be about. The title I was given is Ukraine from Revolution to War. So I'd like to start with the revolution, the uprising in Kiev in February, before turning to the war in the east. I was in Kiev in February, and what I saw was an old-fashioned civic uprising, symbolised by the humble cobblestone, and I'll explain why. Exactly a year ago, when what were initially called the Euromaidan protests were only a few weeks old, and people were still thinking in terms of the Orange Revolution paradigm of revolution as peaceful carnival from 2004, a French colleague of mine said, "How can this be a revolution? No one is throwing cobblestones." It's a very French perspective, I guess, thinking of Paris in 1968 or the June Rebellion, 1832. In a similar way, though, the largely ineffectual Bolotnaya protests in Moscow in 2011 and 2012, they were not even remotely revolutionary, apart from in their consequences, especially in terms of Putin's subsequent conservative values campaign, were nevertheless prefaced by the Pussy Riot song, Osvobodi Krushatku, Unleash the Cobblestones. This turned out to be wishful thinking on their part, but in Kiev, the cobblestones were indeed freed or unleashed. After the confrontations on Khrushchevsky Street began on the 19th of January, the last month of the protest was very different to the first 2 months. This was far from a non-violent revolution, though it was one of extremely unequal force. The protesters had other weapons besides cobblestones, Molotov cocktails, famously a catapult constructed from online instructions. But the civic nature of the protest meant cannibalising your own city. It's a bit dark, but as you can sort of see from this picture, which was taken on Monday the 17th of February, the day before the final cycle of confrontation began. This was February, so initially barricades had been made of snow, which was finally melting. So you can see that the barricades are made of the city itself, and advertising called it a park bench, just trees, simple rubbish. And the most important part of the city was the cobblestones. This photo was taken the next, those of you who know Kiev, it's on Institutska Street. It's Tuesday the 18th of February. And Institutska Street was the scene of confrontations between the protesters and the militia, back and forth from Parliament to the Maidan. What it shows is an improvised human chain, delivering the cobblestones to the skirmishers, the militia, further up to the left. All sorts of people are in the chain, including a rather well-dressed woman in white, who seems to have done her job and is going back to the office. But most strikingly, this rather elderly woman at the front. My daughter came up with the excellent idea of dedicating this book to the unknown grandmother of Kiev, and that will happen with the second edition. But as you can see, she doesn't look like a very professional revolutionary. She has a little blue and yellow symbol she's made herself, but she still has what looks like her shopping in a blue plastic bag. So this is very civic in the sense of all elements of population being involved. And the human chain goes up the street to here. This is the other end where the cobblestones are actually being thrown at the other end of the line. This next picture is Thursday morning, the 20th of February, on Krещатик, when so many were killed by snipers. But as you can see, the cobblestones are still needed as supplies for what turned out to be the final confrontation. This photo shows many things. There are cobblestones in the background piled up for use. This is actually outside the post office, about 10 metres from the Maidan. So there's one fighter taking a rest. You can also see these bare-chested Cossacks beating out the call to battle on their kettle drum. This is the very moment when sniper fire is raining down. But then the cobblestones have other uses. This picture was taken in May. After the protests were over, the stones were used to make memorials. This is at the bottom of Institutska Street, on the edge of the Maidan. Sniper fire came from up the hill. In the background, so the cobblestones both physically construct a memorial and are used to place candles and mementos to the dead. That's just to the right. So there's a gap up in to go to where the snipers' firing positions were on the other side, far side of the open. Many of those who were killed more or less fell right here. The cobblestones were also used to make art and political messages. This again is in May. Again, it's on the Maidan. There are two slogans. One is "Stop Propaganda," and the other is "There is no fascism here." Written with cobblestones, painted in national colours, below a Ukrainian heart in national colours. And then the final phase is the boring old city council preparing to put things back to normal. This photo shows replacement cobblestones lined up on Krещатик, which went back in the early summer. So the cobblestones were symbolic of all the many stages of the uprising, including its eventual normalisation. But if the cold stone is a good symbol of the uprising in Kiev, I don't really have a single symbol for the second part of the talk, the war in the east. But the following pictures all have something in common. They're all part of Russia's world of myths or fakes or hybrid war. First is the humanitarian convoy that dominated the TV news in August. This proved to be many things other than simply an aid mission. It was feared to be a Trojan horse to bring men and materials across the border. Allegedly, its return journey was just as important. Whole factories were dismantled and moved east to Russia, like the USSR stripping eastern Germany in the late 40s. But it was mainly a decoy for a different type of border crossing, a conventional invasion that destroyed the Ukrainian army's willingness to fight in late August and early September. A more familiar image of sort of little green men, soldiers with no insignia. Another fake idea, Novorossiya, or New Russia. Every map that I looked up actually was different. This is one of the many versions of the geography. The Russian Academy of Sciences actually is producing an official history of Novorossiya, which is due to come out in February or March. Hopefully there'll be a useful map on page 2 which will tell us what Russia is aiming for. It's a non-observant election observer. During the voting in Donbass, he is saying he saw no sign of military pressure or men in uniform potentially intimidating voters. There's one right behind him. This is something you really need to watch yourself. It's so amazing. The Night Wolves, Putin's favourite biker band, primetime TV extravaganza on Russian TV in Sevastopol in August. There are many scenes in this which are hard to believe. This is Ukrainians goose-stepping in swastika formation with torches, Nazi style. This is an election poster for the opposition bloc. A much more pro-Russian entity than the old ruling party of regions ever was, but is standing for peace. This little boy in the midst of the ruins is for peace. So here I have a lot of myth, basically. False objects and narratives, but of course with a lot of real consequences. MH17 wreckage. Here's what's left of Donetsk Airport's control tower. So that's the end of the slideshow. What the second set of images, as I say, have in common is this Russian modus operandi of myth and invention. And it is, of course, Russia's intervention that changed the subject of this lecture from potential revolution, at least, to actual war. But it is important to remind ourselves of that change and of what the original story was supposed to be about. Namely, a genuinely civic uprising in the attempt to change Ukraine for the better, and the desire to do better this time than after 2004. We'll never know counterfactually how good an attempt at transformation Ukraine might have made if Russia had not intervened. Every student of transition emphasises the importance of using what Leszek Balcerowicz called extraordinary politics and front-loading radical measures to drive change while you are still popular. But this chance may have been missed as Russia did intervene, though for many voters the October elections were a chance to get back to this original narrative, to put the problems of East Ukraine in a box, to rewind back to February and to change Ukraine for the better. So this really is the key question. Has this opportunity been lost? Is it too late? What are the chances of transforming Ukraine? For the rest of my talk, I want to develop three main themes of this book, the Ukraine crisis. The core of the book is obviously about Ukraine. But I also had a lot to say about Russia, and this is as much a Russian crisis as it is a Ukraine crisis, if not more so. I also wrote about the West, partly about our slowness to show solidarity with Ukrainians to Russia, but also about how Russia has exploited many of the weaknesses and foibles of the West. So firstly, Russia. In order to understand Russia's aims towards Ukraine, we have to know two things. First is not to focus on Putin as an individual or on what Putin wants, but instead to look at the modus operandi of Putin's Russia, which is this world of the fake, encapsulated in the term political technology. Second is to recognise that Russia therefore has few real core beliefs. One is Putin's repeated assertion that Ukraine is not a real country. So we may not always know Putin's next step, but we do know the general plan. That Russia will go as far as it can to prove that assertion that Ukraine is not a real country. But it will work within the paradigms of what is called political technology. Russia has other problems, corruption, an explicit great power disdain for small state sovereignty. But what is unique about modern Russia is this political culture. Not inevitable authoritarianism, which is also a myth spun by that culture. The Western myth that Russia is doomed to autocracy is the mirror image of the Russian myth that the country can only be governed by an autocrat. The problem is more with this manipulative culture of the many types of political technology. I wrote another book, which I wrote on the subject, it came out in 2005. But since it came out, the use of such methods has only spread. Originally, political technology was used to achieve control over Russian domestic politics. Then it was used to control NGOs. NGOs in Russia are gongos, government-organised, non-government organisations. In part because 2005 was also the year when the Kremlin wrongly diagnosed Ukraine's first revolution as an NGO-fronted operation. So Russia set up its civic chamber and its own NGOs instead. Russia set up a parallel system of election monitoring. Huge amounts have been spent on what is normally termed propaganda. It is actually better defined by the Russians' own term, which is information war. Which is not a competition of ideas or information, but to quote, the latent information management of the opponent's internal economic and cultural processes and information psychological aggression based on economic, political and diplomatic pressure. That's a quote from a Russian book on information war. So the stress is more on war than it is on information. These methods have then spread into Russia's neighbourhood policy. Zbigniew Brzezinski once said that the EU's neighbourhood policy was based on a category mistake. Its real goal was not so much to change countries like Ukraine, but to change Russia. Transforming the periphery would not be possible without changing Russia. But it didn't work in quite that way. The European neighbourhood policy didn't indirectly civilise Russia. It encouraged it to compete, to create its own Russian neighbourhood policy using its own warped methodology. And the idea of looking at Russian soft power became very fashionable. It was very different to European soft power. It was so-called Russian soft power was softer power, including any means of coercion not involving attacks. It was also, in the English phrase, softly power, quiet or unseen. As encapsulated in the Russian phrase, kulwarna politika, politics in corridors, not just away from public influence, but without any formal record. Academics kind of realised, therefore, that talking about Russian soft power wasn't really right at all, but they struggled to find a decent alternative. I actually came across the right term in of all places, Anna Karenina, by Tolstoy, where he writes about grubaya sila, coarse power. Because whatever it does, Russia's modus operandi is always coarse. So finally, the buzzword of 2014, hybrid war, is only the latest offshoot of political technology and this type of coarse power. What all these types of political technology have in common is the manipulation of meaning and understanding. And the most important aspect of this is myth production. Unfortunately, Russian political technologists are quite good at what they do. They're much cleverer than the Soviet propagandists ever were, in part because they don't want to change the West or proselytize it, but work with a grain of its faults and foibles. They also have the Kremlin's resources built up during the energy boom of Putin's early years. They also benefit from their mirror image in the West, the so-called Russlandversteher, Russia understands. This is a hubristic and dangerous term, not just because such individuals might promote bad policy, but because they don't understand in a proper critical or analytical sense. They simply present Russia's point of view to the West. But even more seriously, by saying we must respect and accommodate Russia's feelings and interests, they don't understand that so much of Russian discourse has its origins in myth-making political technology. So many of the tropes we hear about so much about in the West are memes or tropes of political technology. Russia has been humiliated. Russia is surrounded by enemies. The West destroyed the USSR. Some of these have a kernel of truth, some have not at all. So our problem in the West is not just classic appeasement, nor is it just that we've internalised so much of Russia's agenda. It's that we don't understand the nature of that agenda and the modus operandi that generates it. So where does that leave us with regard to Ukraine? Well, Crimea, you can understand, was not a one-off. The operation in East Ukraine was not mission creep. The two self-proclaimed Donbass republics are not enough in themselves. We must assume that Putin will continue to go further and continue to destabilise Ukraine until he has proved his main point, which is that Ukraine is not a real country, so it does not deserve to have a functioning state, let alone a powerful state that has what Vladislav Surkov, Putin's key political technologist, likes to call konkurentnost sposobnost, the ability to compete. In Russia's world, only the strong survive. According to Putin's annual address only a week ago, either we remain a sovereign nation or we dissolve without trace. A kind of false dilemma. But because Ukraine is not strong, it does not, in Putin's word, deserve sovereignty. More specifically, Russia does not have what it wants in Ukraine yet in order to achieve that. It wants three things. It wants to preserve its existing gains and to make them viable. Conversely, it wants Ukraine in its reform project not to be viable. In order to do so, it wants to preserve its leverage and its ability to make trouble in Ukraine. So there are various possible scenarios. One, Russia's August counter-offensive and the kind of fighting since the ceasefire has clearly had economic as well as military objectives and was designed to increase the economic viability of the republics in the east. It has not done so yet. The pre-war population in the areas currently controlled was 3.8 billion, it's now probably near 3. That's too big to be subsidised, but too small to be viable on its own. Most of the fighting is concentrated on economic assets, airports, railways, energy links. But the traditional economic key to the region is mail. Its railways and ports bring in supplies and imports, and then export the end products. Crimea is also facing huge problems with sustainability, transport links, water and electricity supplies. So there's a real threat of military action to improve the economic viability of these regions. Second, Ukraine will use all of its many means of making trouble within Ukraine as a whole. Currently, its first bet is its fifth column. The new opposition bloc is much more pro-Russian than the Party of Regions ever was. It has just over 10% of the seats in the parliament. Putin is clearly hoping that the new Ukrainian patriotism is only skin deep, and that public opinion in soft east and south will shift towards the bloc once economic difficulties worsen and all the new government flounders. Third, if the opposite happens and Russia loses hope of gaining control over Kiev's policies, then it can return to its Novorossiya plans and try and foment unrest in other areas via special operations in the softer east. What most generally, the excellent American analyst Samuel Chapman recently made an interesting argument. The West has two separate narratives of what is happening in Ukraine. One is the reform narrative, what needs to be done. The other is the Russian intervention analysis, what Russia has done or might do. But the two are linked. Putin is intervening in Ukraine to maintain leverage over Ukraine. Successful reform in Ukraine would actually threaten that leverage. Therefore, says Chapman, if Ukraine succeeds in its reforms, further Russian economic warfare or direct military intervention in the east will become much more likely. Whether it's true or not, Western strategy should be based on breaking this link and preventing Chapman's prediction from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Which means that Ukraine needs breathing space to reform. And Russia must be deterred or incentivized so that it provides that breathing space. So our final section is about the most basic question of all. Can Ukraine transform itself? And can it do so when it is subject to so much Russian pressure and Russian spoiler power? There are three factors here. One is the Ukrainian political elite, political and business elite. Second is Ukrainian civil society, and the third is how Russia influences them both. The main reason why it's been so difficult to transform Ukraine in the near quarter century since 1991 is it has been so poorly served by its political class. Its well-known internal divisions have also been a factor. Would have been less of a factor if its politicians had been brave enough or competent enough to transcend those divisions. Instead, they have exploited and exacerbated them to stay in power. So one of the questions I try to answer in my book is answering the question just why is the Ukrainian political class so hopeless? Historical factors are obviously important. One is what might be called the Gogol syndrome historically. many talented Ukrainians made their career in St. Petersburg or Moscow, leaving brain drain at home. Empires repel as well as attract. The repeated purges and repressions of the Ukrainian intelligentsia are the other side of that particular coin. More controversial is the role of the Holodomor, which led not just to depopulation in the rural east and the replacement and the influx of so many Russian speakers, but to changes in the nature of the elite. But my argument really was all about one key post-independence factor, which is the difference between a resource state and a rentier state. Independent Ukraine did not have the abundant energy resources of Russia or Azerbaijan, but it had energy transit and some raw materials. So some money for a corrupt elite, but not enough to satisfy that elite. According to Yulia Mostova, the editor of Ukraine's main opposition paper, understanding Yanukovych was always easy. Quote, he wanted to be the richest man in Eastern Europe. But that led to a problem that was well identified by another analyst, Mikhail Honcha. Yanukovych wanted to be both president and number one oligarch, like all the other guys, Putin, Nazarbayev and Aliyev. Except they have energy and rents to distribute, Ukraine does not. So to put it simply, Yanukovych wanted to be as rich as the other presidents without the riches, but carried on regardless. So Ukraine became an almost pathologically predatory state, with an alleged 50% cut for the elite on some types of business, and a tax and destroy policy destroying its SME sector. So Greek is one answer. Another is political technology again. This is just as important in Ukraine as in Russia. There are many countervailing factors, a freer media in particular, but it's still there, and its roots go very deep. Partly because the elite are so inept and corrupt that they need to disguise their behaviour. So even after the uprising in February, we should recognise that Ukrainian politics is not just corrupt, it's corrupted by the other style of politics, which is still around. It's tempting to dismiss Oleg Lyashko, for example, as a marginal loudmouth, but in fact his combination of oligarch-financed TV populism is arguably perfectly symptomatic of modern Ukraine. Official reports on the elections, as always, over-concentrated on procedure and on counting, and didn't really look at the kind of political technology aspect. The worst of which was the kind of new trend for the use of proxies on Ukrainian TV. So-called experts, so-called ordinary Ukrainians delivering fake opinions to attack opponents. Depressing because, this is the kind of thing that Russia has been doing so much recently. So changing Ukraine is not just about a new president and a new Rada. It's not just about individuals. Attempts at marginal change probably failed, so Ukraine must be radical. At the very least, the worst excesses of Yanukovych's predatory state must be reined in. But the political culture needs to change. An oligarchy will not disappear because individual oligarchs change. The American robber barons of the 19th century didn't suddenly become better men overnight. They changed because they were forced to change by Congress and the courts. So the same thing must happen in Ukraine. The legal system must put an end to the worst excesses of the oligarchy.
But Ukraine is not like Russia or Azerbaijan, where most corruption comes from natural resources. It comes mainly from the state budget, from schemes and scams. So cleaning up the budget will both be a virtue in itself and will diminish the opportunities that the oligarchy have to exist. The other side of this question is another question, which is, if the political class is so poor, how come civil society is so far in advance of the political class? And I have a few tentative answers. One is that the political system was also what Russians or Ukrainians call systema. It's kind of self-reproducing, like the idea of the earth as Gaia. So outsiders find it very difficult to enter or change the system. If they enter the system, they tend to be immediately corrupted. That's pretty much the story of what happened in Ukraine after 2004. So that exaggerates the dichotomy between politics and civil society. It's very hard to cross the line. Secondly, there is an overlap between the Russian system and the Ukrainian system. But Russian influence is mainly on political society. So Russia concentrates on keeping politics corrupt, and civil society is left relatively to its own devices, but not completely, given the kind of Russian neighbourhood policy that I talked about earlier. There are some important qualifications. There are Russian NGOs in Ukraine like Ruski Mir, which operate more or less openly. But there's also more covert sponsorship of NGOs and think tanks linked to people like Viktor Medvedchuk or Sergei Rochkin, both part of the old Yanukovych system, pushing a more or less disguised pro-Russian line. Another factor is that civil society uses technology, and the political class largely does not. Compared to Georgia, Ukraine's record in the government is non-existent or woeful. But civil society uses all types of technology. Well, you have new media, like Amateur TV, which is tapped new audiences. New media methods like stopfake.org to try and counteract Russian propaganda. Civil society groups have used innovative crowdsourcing methods to help channel money to the armed forces, setting a standard of transparency that shames the state. Activists and journalists have done excellent work analysing the incriminating documents left behind by the elite at sites like YanukovychLeaks.org. Though my personal favourite technology is the use of drones to flare the houses of mysteriously opulent politicians and expose that on TV. Another factor is nationalism. Way too much attention has been focused on the role of nationalism in the uprising. Patriotism, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is of course a mobilising factor. But we all know or should know about the role of the far right and the fake far right in Russian propaganda. More interestingly, however, it has been argued that looking at nationalism as a cause of protests, in fact, gets cause and effect the wrong way around. Oksana Forstina, the editor of the journal Kritika, has claimed that the protests in 2014 were noticeable for the way in which an actually rather heterogeneous body of protesters co-opted images, symbols and slogans from the nationalist past and put them to their own use. In other words, the protest and the protesters came first and utilised a redefined nationalism to their own means. So even old-fashioned slogans like Slava Heroin, glory to heroes, and even the name Banderite all now mean something completely different. The national flag, according to Faustina, is now not officious the flag of power, but the flag of anybody, of hipsters, doctors, managers and students. So this kind of instrumental postmodernism helped. And finally, some good news for once. There is academic evidence that EU assistance may actually have helped strengthen civil society in Ukraine. And not just through finance and strengthening institutional support, but through socialisation of activists in Western political culture and modus operandi. In fact, it can even be said that many Ukrainian activists now know the West much better than the other way around, and are healthily critical of the West's failures to live up to its own standards. Or to make the claim made by one gentleman in this room, that the Europe of values is now in the East, as opposed to the Europe of rules, which now exists in the European Union. Civil society activists are now entering government and trying to break down this old divide. There are many new faces in the new parliament and new government, probably more than were expected just a few months ago. But civil society and politics, as usual, are still more or less different worlds. And what happens next really is the conflict between those two worlds. So my conclusions are brief. Insofar as the story in Ukraine has indeed changed from revolution to war, we should do everything we can to help Ukraine change it back. The term frozen conflict has a bad name in the former Soviet world for good reasons. But given where Ukraine is now, freezing of, the isolation of the problems in the Donbass, and the prevention of further overspill may be the least bad option. Ukraine still faces the threat of direct subversion and an immediate fiscal crisis. But if it gets through that, there is still this yawning chasm between the corrupt elite and a promising civil society. Russia exploits the gap between the two and still hopes it can re-corrupt the political class. The new parliament will therefore most likely be a transitional one, marked by the struggle between the old and the new. But Russia plus the old politics makes 2 versus civil society, that's 2 against 1. Crude mathematical summary. So the West must help more to redress the balance, make it more 2 against 2, and increase the chances of real change.
Thank you very much. I'm especially pleased that we have around half an hour for discussion, comments, questions on Andrew Wilson. So you're warmly welcome to participate in the debate. Please, we are looking forward to your comments and or questions. Yes, please.
I probably do not deserve to be the first. My name is Michael Humphreys. I used to live in Ukraine back in the 90s. I was in Ukraine again in December and also in March of this year. I still keep links into the country. Fascinating speech and fascinating comments you made, and certainly extremely worrying. And your final comment that the best option at the moment would be a frozen conflict, I think is extremely depressing, but maybe it is accurate. An area which I felt was left out in the comments was, is there anything we could be doing to deal with, cooperate with, coordinate with, whatever, with Russia? because Russia will remain an extremely important strategic partner of the European Union and vice versa. And it cannot be treated purely as a bad ogre or a monster. And I wonder, are there any positive recommendations that can be made in regard to how we in Europe and in the West in general can try to see if the situation vis-a-vis our own cooperation with Russia and ultimately Russia and Ukraine can be changed?
Well, there are many dangers in how we approach Russia. I guess there's a kind of standard think tank formula, because I do work for a think tank. When there's a diplomatic problem, you park the problem and you try and cooperate in other areas to move into different modes. Well, that's possible but difficult with Russia, because Russia has such a trading mentality, and since the summer has been more or less offering to trade. You know, let's forget about Ukraine because you need us. You need our cooperation on Iran or Syria, etc. That's a variable truth. I'm not sure if we do need Russia in even those areas. But insofar as it is true, we have to do it without trading. It cannot be on the basis of giving Russia what it wants in Ukraine. So that kind of track has to be frozen also. And sanctions have to remain because sanctions are working. Sanctions are much tougher than Russia expected. There are people within Europe who want to build them down already and normalise the relationship with Russia, but it's too soon. Fortunately, the EU is a bureaucratic organisation, so the next decision-making opportunity to do that is only this spring. But a lot of pressure will come on to change things in the spring. There have been other suggestions. Why not talk to the Russians via the Eurasian Union, for example, which is something they want. I can see the advantages in doing that. It's less worrying now that Ukraine is not being coerced to join it. But even the 3.5 potential members of that union are not entirely happy with the project. That's Belarus, Kazakhstan and Armenia. So there are some problems with endorsing that project. Russia has always wanted a broader pan-European security dialogue. There are good and bad arguments for that. One of the good arguments is that there are so many countries in Europe but without adequate security, Ukraine obviously being now one of them. So there is perhaps scope for a genuine pan-European, Helsinki 2 security dialogue. All of this has to be twin track or multiple track. We can't trade because then we will lose. But sure, we need to talk.
Thank you, Andrew, for your comments. And I have 3 questions.
Did you have 3?
I can do it one by one. Distribution. Now, they're a little bit provocative. Do you think that the EU should apply the same mechanisms to Russia, to the Eurasian Union, which Russia does to the EU? For example, Russia is trying to split the EU from within, talking to particular states, not to EU as a whole. Do you think that the EU should do the same like talking bilaterally with Belarus, talking bilaterally to Kazakhstan, talking bilaterally to Armenia, and you know, trying to play the same game. Do you think also, for example, the Russian approach is like, well, you signed this association agreement without talking to me, that's too bad, and if you follow these recent Putin remarks, it's all about this. And we in Ukraine and EU are saying, well, this is an intrusion into bilateral relations, etc. But do you think that the EU can say the same? Like, you guys established the Eurasian Union without talking to us. It harms our trade interests, whatever your increased tariffs, etc. And the last question, the security issue. I mean, is there any chance for Ukraine to get some kind of enhanced security guarantees or something from the EU? Understanding that the EU is not a security organization, whatever. What can be the mechanism? What can be the concrete mechanism for Ukraine to inject some security element into our relations with the EU? Thanks.
Well, talking to Belarus or Kazakhstan isn't the same as playing divide and rule. Naturally, the EU is very different to Russia. You know, it doesn't play realpolitik in the same way. In fact, its whole raison d'etre is more or less the opposite. So it's difficult to see who would actually do that. You know, who would be the actor here? To be honest, there are part of the story of the Chinese partnership is you do have two Europes. You do have a Europe of rules and bureaucrats and policies, but you do also have a Europe of power and realpolitik and certain foreign ministers, which aren't always coordinated. And people sometimes say the Eastern Partnership had a problem that it was had the problem that it was underlying problem that it wasn't sure whether it was a policy about rules or a policy about exporting or about geopolitics. But actually, it was pretty clear that it was 90% EU norms and rules with a little bit of geopolitics. So really your question comes down to changing the balance a bit. Can we be a little bit more geopolitical? Well, I think clearly we are with respect to Belarus, for example. The question is whether or not that's a good thing. If you look at the kind of trajectories that Belarus and Azerbaijan have taken in 2014, they're more or less completely opposite. Azerbaijan has used the crisis as an opportunity to crack down. Belarus is quite freaked in foreign policy terms. And of course, Belarus is 90% Russian speaking. If Russian speakers are suddenly a potentially disloyal constituency, and that's very worrying. So Belarus is kind of moving in the opposite direction of trying to expand it, Lukashenko trying to expand his political base. And I think his favourite term is a two-winged foreign policy. That's trying to flatten the other wing a bit. So there are overtures to us. But there are dangers, if we chuck out all the rules and the conditionality. That then creates a double standard. But that seems almost certain to be what's going to happen. But Lukashenko faces an election in 2015. Is the EU going to object in the current circumstances to whatever he does? I rather doubt it. He'll probably get quite a free ride. So the EU is doing a little bit of that, but there are consequences. And we're not Russia. Ukraine clearly has a big security problem because it has none of the muted solutions really work. The old idea was rapprochement with NATO. Ukraine still has a sovereign right to do that. Clearly that's politically awkward. The other is this possible pan-European security dialogue, which has some life, but Medvedev's proposal actually rather took the life out of some of that dialogue because it was so blatantly bilateral and designed to undermine existing institutions. Something in the middle might be security guarantees for Ukraine from big member states. But the Budapest memorandum, as we all know, didn't work very well. Largely because it was a product of its time and its wording is all about nuclear weapons. Ukraine is giving us the claim to them, and therefore, if it is subject to, I can't remember the exact words, if it's subject to nuclear blackmail, the other powers will have it, which is a very specific circumstance. Whether there is scope for the big member states to repeat that process and do it at that time, who knows? So in terms of big headline treaties or whatever, well, someone needs to do some creative thinking if we're going to get anywhere near that. But there are plenty of little things that can help. I think the West made a big mistake in the origins of the crisis when both America and the EU ruled out a military option. Even if it's extremely unlikely, you don't tell your opponent what you're not going to do. Even in 2008, when we were much criticised for not helping Georgia enough, Russia was deterred to an extent by uncertainty. Didn't know what America was going to do with its fleet. But that's kind of a counterfactual. And there's plenty of, there's a bill on lethal defensive aid for the US Congress. There's plenty of stuff that the West can help with in non-lethal aid, which is basically help with freezing either the de facto internal border or the real border in Ukraine. Needs a lot of help with practical securitization. In some ways, we've been pushing for the wrong type of border in the last 10 years. We've been saying you don't need the old Soviet-style scary border with guys with guns. You want, it's all about economic crime, and you want to police that properly. Well, in fact, I believe Ukraine should be going back in the other direction. And its customs services, etc., were probably the most corrupt part of it, one of the most corrupt part of the Yanukovych state. So helping with basic law and order, and there is this EU mission that started on 1st of December. It has, I think, €13 million budget. It's mainly focused on the legal sector. But a similar kind of more expanded mission, looking at guard security, help would be a big help.
Thank you, so for your speech. It was very interesting. Can you tell me more about the role of nationalism in Ukraine? We know that Ukraine has deeper internal problems because of its history. We cannot only divide the country into two groups, like the pro-Russians and the pro-Western supporters, but we also have to consider the minorities there. So, do you think that Putin's plans are aimed to destabilize the country and make the political scene recognizing his power, the power of Russia in the international scene?
Andrei will answer some of those questions. Also an expert on this subject. Well, what do we know and what's changed? Well, we know that Putin's grand project of Novorossiya isn't going to work. Ukraine isn't going to split into in that way. There's plenty of short-term evidence from real voting, presidential and parliament elections, and from opinion polls that show that Ukraine is more homogenous, more patriotic, and more united than it was. Poroshenko famously won in every oblast. Similar, though more differentiated picture in the Rada elections. In opinion polls, people are more supportive of independence, unity, a unitary state. They're more pro-European. They're pretty clear about who's to blame for the current troubles. The question is whether that's a kind of short-term reaction or the beginnings, as some people hope or observe, that Putin, the nation builder, is part a joke and part of reality. Because there are two aspects of this process. The initial uprising is part of the process, in which the dynamic was really domestic, outright, not really about Russia at all. And then the subsequent conflict. I quickly quoted Forrestina about the kind of new meaning of national symbols. And you do get this phenomenon, Andrei will correct me, which those are two dirty words. Because the word Žid is pejorative in the way that Yevray isn't for Jew, and Banderidas is the meaning, so very different. So now it means, a Jewish patriotic Ukraine. So that's the trend, I think, and it's clear. The question is how far it goes. If because this is civic nation building, and a CIDES also needs to be successful. So it depends on how well the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian economy does as well. But you can see all sorts of indications of this new national, this new patriotism, and the way that the relationship between nationalism and national symbols has been inverted and reinvented. Though if you've got people abroad who are still thinking in terms of the old paradigms, perhaps it's good to explain to them what's going on. You could have a dialogue with the Poles, for example, about changing national symbols. In terms of minorities, Andrei is the expert on the kind of Jewish question. Most seem to be participatory, though it's part of Russia's modus operandi to target national minorities if it thinks they are exploitable, like the Gagons in Moldova. One can see both Russia and certain circles in Hungary trying to make trouble in Transcarpathia, the Rusini, for example, without, I don't personally think with much chances of success. And there are some worrying signs in the kind of, again, Andrei is the expert on Dnipropetrovsk. In many of these parts, in Kharkiv, is very noticeable that virtually the entire elite survived the election. So Kharkiv is quiet because the old elite is still there. Odessa turnout was, I think, the lowest in Ukraine. In most of these regions, the opposition bloc actually came first, but it was outvoted by the general vote for the pro-European party. So not everything is comfortable. There are factors that Russia could exploit But as everybody asserts, Ukraine, minus half of Donbass, minus Crimea, is a more united country than anyone.
So now the last questions, maybe we'll so lot of them. So then maybe, okay, so we'll collect 3 questions, yes, and we'll ask you to try to answer them like in 7-8 minutes. So first, please, Petra, then Savik and Claudia.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for your comments and presentation. Indeed, very well presented. I wish to ask your opinion on the Ukraine situation impact on Russia's broad public and the public perception, which is changing in Russia. But how do you see it going in Russia? And what kind of the conclusions we might draw from the situation up to now? I mean, from the Russian perspective, I mean, how the Russian public views the events in Ukraine in a changing times there. And my second question would be, I mean, what kind of the scenario for EU-Russia relations you would see taking into account the present, well, so far good position, I mean, solid, united. I mean, do you believe it may remain as it is for a longer period of time? Because we need this, and we have to do everything possible to keep this line.
Oh, you want them all together?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So it will be a similar question, but very simple. Andrew, you said about independent Ukraine, about Ukraine united for Western, which is all of it is true. And basically, it's not necessarily perceived as a revolution; it's a war of independence as well, in a very serious way, away from the USSR. So, in this sense, and looking back to European history, and looking how this conference is called, Ukraine is a test for European solidarity. How much does today's Europe, European Union, or Europe in a broader sense, need an independent, Western-leaning, NATO-dreaming Ukraine? Give me your
My question is, why did the West swallow the Crimea annexation? I mean, we are talking about Donetsk, or the Donetsk separatists is horrible, etc., etc. But the whole world was more or less quiet about Crimea.
And now we'll have a brief and inspiring answer from Andrew.
First 2 questions. Putin, as we know, has a stratospheric rating, 86, 87%. Western leaders will pull their own arm off to get that kind of rating. Which therefore tells us that Russia is a completely different political system, and the ratings mean different things. In fact, it's almost like Putin is addicted to this kind of high level of support. That's how he mobilizes society around him. So one question mark is whether this requires permanent mobilization, constant refreshment, because there are signs of people flagging already. Partly because there are problems with the political technology, because a lot of it is not particularly grounded in reality. There's a really scary quote from the Russian Deputy Minister. We don't care about facts, we just produce emotional narratives. But the facts in true. So, body bags, dead Russian young man, all of that shows in the kind of, some of the opinion polls in Russia show decreasing readiness to fight a conventional war. So you have to disguise that. But Putin's speech a few days ago was really internally focused. It was all about mobilization, stay united, stay the course. because any leader at Geremek would rightly be nervous about whether that would be true. Because the economic cost is going to be felt much more sharply in the next 6 months. And a fish rots from the head. Actually, Putin has a bigger problem with the elite, they're the least interesting part of the population. All of this nonsense about repatriating their capital shows that they haven't done it yet. So probably solid for now, because Russia is a propaganda state, in practice we appear. I was tempted to say that the same about EU and Russia, but the underlying picture is actually different. Yes, we are in a relatively united position with much stronger sanctions than Russia expected. Whether that would have happened without M17, I rather doubt. Yes, America had moved the day before, so Europe was under pressure to copy, but Europe is very poor at responding to pressure. So you get people talking about normalisation, ready, meeting ready. Germany is key and indicative, not just because it's the central power, but if you look what's happened. Actually, some rude stuff about Germany here, which is outdated. Because Merkel has changed a lot in the last few months. Much tougher with Putin. Personal level, just fed up with being lied to. But German business is almost running a parallel foreign policy. They want to talk to the Russians, they want to normalise. So it's that imbalance between politics and commercial interests. Which leads to the second question. The chapter 1 in the book is about the world since 2008. And Europe since 2008, we've got economic problems, we've become much more introspective, much more mercantilist, much more worried about standard of living, much more selfish, much more introspective, and Russia can exploit. So in terms of public opinion, it is quite shocking, really, how quickly the crisis has disappeared from our front pages before it's finished. And if you look at the NATO summit in September, it was striking and shocking that we came up with something resembling a plan for Syria, whether it's good or not, but almost nothing for Ukraine. There are good reasons for Syria. Yes, that's about jihadis coming home, domestic roots of terrorism, putting right what we did wrong 10 years ago. But if you ask me, it's crystal clear that what happens in Ukraine is much, much more important. Ultimately, Syria is not Europe, Ukrainians. It's a literal frontier. It's also a literal frontier. But it's also the kind of front line in terms of Russia's modus operandi is already everywhere in Europe. So Ukraine can't be a barrier. But it is crucial to the way that Russia penetrates and corrupts our politics, our media space, our business so much. To my mind, that's clear. Convincing ordinary European public opinion is why did the West follow the Crimean annexation? Well, it didn't.
We did.
De facto, we have some, de jure, we have some policies in place which make this. Because of non-recognition, because of the threat of sanctions, Aeroflot does not fly there, because it's afraid of sanctions. Big Russian banks do not operate there because they're afraid of sanctions. And that de jure position matters. So we have to hold it for as long as necessary. Baltic states, we held it for almost 50 years. But in private, you get people saying, particularly to Ukrainians, forget about it, it's lost. We have to concentrate on other things, which is big, which is shocking. There was the technical matter of speed. This was political technology blitzkrieg. It happened so quickly, everybody was surprised, indicating that there was a previous plan.
It happened so quickly with Austria in 1938. Do you remember?
So everybody was surprised by annexation because they expected another frozen conflict or sort of Afghani scenario. But given the number of hiding forces that one hears, then the de jure position has to be maintained for as long as necessary.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Let us also thank Andrew Winston again. Now we'll have a short break, a really short one, and afterwards there will be the first panel, moderated by Natalia Gumanyuk, who is actually one of the co-founders of Hromadske TV mentioned by Andrew. So we hope to see you all in 15 minutes.